The following program contains depictions of sexual violence. Listener discretion is advised.
Broadcasting from the far side of Enceladus, beaming in at the speed of light across the vast chasms of space, streaming directly into your brain, you're listening to the Spartacast League. I am Faolan, and joining us tonight are Attica and Eno. So get ready, strap in, because tonight we're covering the whole gamut on immigration, because last week, just after we'd gotten on the air, a couple days later, President Trump made a speech referring to immigrants as animals. Now, I want to clarify here because it is very important that we make this distinction. His actual comments were in regards to a minor street gang called MS-13, which has about 10,000 members in the United States, and supposedly about a third of them have already been deported. However, anytime the comments of immigration comes up, MS-13 is almost always invoked by the president, and then he goes into referring to them, MS-13, as animals every time within the context of immigration is brought up.
After having made the statement, as you might imagine from the other side, there was a lot of vitriol and rebuke concerning the cavalier attitude he expressed toward the dehumanization of immigrants as a whole by implication. And he, in fact, doubled down, believe it or not, stating more significantly, I believe this time, that they are not people.
So essentially what he's doing is he's giving himself plausible deniability by talking about criminals, the criminal gang of brown people who's totally marauding around white middle-class suburbs and, stealing daughters in the middle of the night. Those criminals are animals, while talking in the context of immigrants in general. So he just gives himself plausible deniability. It's right that you people don't just fucking fall for it.
Exactly. What they were hoping would be done is that liberals and people on the left would fall into the direct trap so that then they could accuse us of lying and conflating things, thus giving them ammo to attack us and say, look how loony and crazy we are.
Which is uncharacteristically clever, in my opinion, and my experience reading about the hilarious shenanigans of this cabinet. I shouldn't wonder, though, and I think that this is halfway between folly and food for thought, how much can they cement this position without going from dog whistle, as has been the case so far, to overt racism and dehumanization? I wonder where the tipping point is and whether he'll triple down if he's called on it again or if he's just bored with this subject already.
I mean, liberals will go, oh, Trump is fat and he's stupid, haha. But, Trump knows how to get away with being a little shit. And I think he knows that the fire is on enough that he can't do the overt racism yet. Hitler didn't even really necessarily do the overt racism, within the first 2 years. Had we not spent a year and a half beating down the alt-right at every corner and dismantling their groups and, waiting outside their houses to catch them in literal incest cuckolding fests, you'd have the street support to be able to just be overtly racist, right? And then, the reaction would wholly be on the left to actually do something about it because the liberals are just gonna, oh my God, and go march in a circle. So, I think he knows he can't do the overt racism yet. Does he have to? I mean, he's got all of federal law enforcement at his disposal. White supremacists have already infiltrated the police. The FBI admitted that. We talked about that last show. The ability to carry out force to enforce the overt racism is there. So is it really anything but self-gratification for him to be overtly racist?
So he doesn't have to be overtly racist. All he has to do is slowly prompt people into behaviors. This is a normalization technique. This is using weaponized psychology on people.
And, it might be called low-hanging fruit to compare this, again, to Nazi Germany and other, I guess, less noteworthy fascist regimes in recent history. But we need to bear in mind that it didn't start with overt racism in Nazi Germany. It was largely an economic thing. Why are we in a depression? Well, it's all these wealthy businessmen. You notice anything about all these wealthy businessmen, a certain ethnic thing? And then it became a security thing. Well, why did we lose the First World War? Why did everything turn out like it did? It's incredibly easy to draw parallels to Nazi Germany, and it's been done to death since before he got elected. But I think it is worth noting how very similar the dog whistle racism, jingoism, and xenophobia espoused by this cabinet really is. And I would also like to point out that so far since he's been elected, dog whistle racism has had a dramatic effect on the day-to-day doings of Americans.
Even though he does seem to be emboldening the actions of ICE and Customs and Border Patrol protections, the important thing to keep in mind here, all of this that we are going to be talking about has continuously went on since at least Reagan. There has been 35 years at least of this policy in some form. So it's important to keep that in mind. But one of the things that really did stand out is that there was a video, which now seems to be scrubbed off of Facebook, that actually shows a woman. She was a 20-year-old Guatemalan woman named Claudia Patricia Gomez Gonzalez that was in Rio Bravo hiding from Border Patrol, and they just executed her, shot her in the head. The person recording the video is freaking out, asking, why did you shoot her? And they were trying to play it off like it was just a taser.
Yeah, there's a quote from a video that any of you might find still on Facebook from Telesur, wherein it struck me as very partisan, but there is a very meaningful quote in there. This woman said before they fired, when they had weapons drawn, she asked them why they had them drawn, and they said, these are tasers, these are tasers. And then they shot the woman in the head. My understanding, without having seen actual video footage of it, my understanding from context was that one shot was fired, and one shot to the head, that's not an easy thing to do, and that's not something you do by accident. That is, I can't imagine a context in which you could characterize that as anything other than an execution.
From what I saw of the video that was released, even though it was heavily edited, I think that what we saw wasn't too much out of context.
That just betrays the way that they think about these immigrants, the way they think about people, that they're not people, that they don't know what a gun is or what a taser looks like. You hit them on the head and say it's a taser, and then you shoot them. These people, they want to do this job because they want to kill people. And that's the bottom line. These people they see as the race enemy and the national enemy, and they're there as soldiers to kill the enemy, and that's why they do that job, and that's why they want to do that job. That's why they want to be Border Patrol.
Well, not all Border Patrol are white. In fact, at the last State of the Union, I believe, Donald Trump had a token Hispanic person that was a Border Protections agent.
Oh boy. There's a heavy level of Hispanic classism too.
Yes, there is.
It dates back to before the Mexican-American War. It's labor relations. It's the Mexican ranch owners.
Well, they do that to construct an image. So that's all tokenism.
Well, one thing I did note in our last show that especially pertains to my experiences growing up with the sheriff's deputy, even if there are genuinely kind and moral people in these law enforcement agencies, even if they attract largely dangerous people, one good apple will get spoiled by the bunch, you might say. They produce a very toxic culture, a very reactionary culture, a very us versus them culture. And when you join a law enforcement agency, it becomes less us versus them as race or class is concerned, and more us versus them, first responders versus civilians.
It's a little bit how, in the Army, when you go through basic training, there's kind of a bit of a mind control aspect to it, where they indoctrinate you in what is essentially a cult-like mentality.
Yeah, there have been a number of studies conducted on that, and I'll try and dig it up sometime and point you toward a very interesting one that was focused largely on shot per kill ratios between World War II and the Vietnam War. You might note that the end of the Korean War is when the United States military started using psychology to condition young recruits to be more effective killers. There are a number of papers on it, and anyone listening to this might do themselves a very miserable favor and go look them up.
With the culture that ICE and border protections has fostered, it's kind of disturbing, like when you hear like the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos or DeVoe, whatever her name is, come out and say that it should be the school's decision on whether or not they get to call ICE on students living within their district, which is interesting because that actually violates a court ruling. It was Plyer versus Doe that pretty much guarantees that illegal children, or rather undocumented children, I should say, living within the United States are guaranteed education as a right.
I should say that, like, the vast majority of the stuff that comes out of this administration's mouth is about testing where the law sits. Because the law is only not enforced in terms of the police. The law for the public good is only upheld by the public. And a lot of the things this administration says and does seems to be about trying to figure out, okay, how much of the law still applies? How much can we just do whatever the hell we want because people aren't actually going to do anything about it?
Yeah, finding the wiggle room within the framework.
Yeah, how weightless is this piece of legal paper? Is this something I can throw in the trash? Is anyone going to actually do anything about this? That's the vast majority of the purpose of the stupid stuff that comes out of this administration's mouth, is about trying to figure out where that is, how much of the law still applies. I think that they repeatedly find, people suddenly give a shit about this law that they'd never heard of. It's the only functioning part of our government at this point. Even then half so, because while sure, courts may uphold Supreme Court rulings saying that undocumented immigrants get to go to school, when the school cop shoots them dead, the school cop gets to get away with it and doesn't get punished by the law. So it's still even only half working. When you hear that kind of weird ass stuff come out of the administration, it's about trying to figure out who actually gives a shit about this. If you think about it, none of the white schools, white middle class schools, are going to have undocumented students going there. Education is so divided by zip code and the credit rating of the parents defining the zip code that they can live in.
It's all segregated.
Yeah, it's entirely segregated. So it would have to be somewhere in Texas where
they tried to desegregate schools by busing in the poorer students into wealthier districts, and people complained about it. They didn't want less fortunate kids going to the so-called good schools. Of course, the argument that they gave at the time period was just to flat out deny that there was any discrepancy between a rich school and a poor school, because it was all the government and everybody was getting the same education and everybody was being tested for the same thing.
Which is categorically and provably false. But I think this issue, and especially what Hems was saying about the trying to find the wiggle room in the framework of laws that already exist, I think this very explicitly underlines the importance of ground-level organizations like journalists and publications, unions, etc., because I'm a bit of a neophyte here, but I would not have known about Fleyler versus Doe. I would not have known that that is a right with legal precedent were it not for this particular story. So there is a great deal of stake that we need to place in the media. I know that everybody is bandying about right now going, the left media or the right media. I think the importance is learning to recognize misinformation and disinformation when you see it, but more importantly, just reading, actually getting out there and finding out about this stuff, because you will learn important and unpleasant things, like I'm learning.
The thing that makes Betsy DeVos's comments disturbing is the fact that this actually came on the eve of the government just announcing we lost 1,475 immigrant children, and then a separate second report documenting thousands upon thousands of cases of physical and sexual abuse within the customs and immigration system.
That, along with UNICEF having reported over 26,000 migrant deaths since 2014. That's a very small span of time for that many casualties from a number of places.
I feel bad, but I'm not surprised. Like, there's no shock emotion.
What kind of people, do you expect would sign up to enforce these kind of laws?
Well, like I said, people who view them as the race enemy. People who just want to kill people because they consider them the enemy of the race and the nation. That's who goes and becomes a concentration camp guard. Someone with absolute devout loyalty to the regime and considers all opponents of the regime to be enemies of the state, which usually ends up meaning its own people. So, I'm not surprised. I read these headlines and I'm just like, yeah, what else is new? It comes off as supposed to be shocking, but I don't feel numb.
Like it was expected.
Yeah.
Well, again, with the rhetoric along the lines of what kind of people do you think are joining to do this job, I feel a need to state again that the linchpin of all of this is a pre-existing culture of toxic nationalism and racism and jingoism in law enforcement and military organizations. I myself know 3 people now who are extreme hard-right folks, libertarian, conservative, and borderline fascist, respectively. And these individuals were just like you or me, fairly empathetic, kind of not super well-read or aware of current events, just really decent people who didn't have their head really in the game at the time. When they joined, 2 of them joined the military and one of them became a police officer. And within less than a year and a half, you've got them spouting these far-right ideals and ideologies that kind of makes you wonder how exactly this training program works. Honestly, I don't want to blow this out of the water or anything, but the differences in their behaviors and their attitudes when they got out of training or when they did their first year or so of work is night and day. It feels like literal brainwashing. You can take pretty much any decent, good-natured, kind person, and with enough conditioning and enough immersion in an extremely toxic and jingoistic culture, you can turn them into a very, very unpleasant sort of individual.
Like I said earlier, the thing that you really do need to keep into consideration, all of this stuff predates Trump. There was a investigation of Border Patrol agent misconduct back in 2012 where they found that they were smuggling drugs, smuggling child porn. Sexual abuse was rampant then. They really didn't do anything about it. A few people got arrested. That was it. And I'd imagine most people just received slaps on the wrist is what it seems like from the report here. And that was it.
From the point of view of the people who would be slapping on the wrist, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. The police aren't trained to serve and protect. They're trained as an occupying military force to occupy neighborhoods that resist the will of the state and crush those neighborhoods under their boot until they accept the state's legitimacy and racism. That's what the police are trained to do. I drive around Scottsdale, I see maybe one cop, and that cop is being all friendly at Chipotle, right? And then I go to where I live, and it's every hour there's a police helicopter circling over with the high beam on, whatever you call the light, the helicopter light, chasing some guy down the road with 5 cars going down. And who knows what the heck he did? He might have just been standing there being black. They're trained as an occupying military force for poor neighborhoods. So when it comes out that they've been acting like a military, killing people and being corrupt and stealing resources, well, they get slaps on the wrist because that's what they're supposed to be doing. That's the purpose.
On the other hand, a lot of people don't realize that protocol of just slapping them on the wrist, and in this case, it's super egregious because it's Border Patrol who have certain special privileges to detain people, and then they're abusing those people that are in detainment.
Well, I think one thing that's very important to look at here is the size and the scale of these organizations and the corruption therein. Back to the hundreds of DHS employees that were fired back in 2012, hundreds, plural. It would be easy to look at that and think, well, that's a big number. They got a lot of them. What percentage of their organization is that? And what percentage in those hundreds people that were fired What percentage is that of the ones who are actually doing it, the ones who got caught and fired? I mean, Department of Homeland Security also between 2009 and 2015, they received 1,246 reports of egregious sexual misconduct. I mean, I don't have to describe it, and I don't want to. And there were 46 follow-up investigations, and we don't know the results of those follow-up investigations, but 46 follow-up investigations out of 1,245 reported cases. Some quick and dirty math gives us just under 4% follow-up on this. It's really hard to look at this and go, well, there is oversight in these organizations. When you look at the facts and you look at the numbers, there is not any considerable level of oversight in these government security organizations.
I do want to put into perspective, so the 2012 report, there were just under 250,000 DHS employees at the time. During that period, there were 59,000 employees that were Border Patrol, I believe. Of that, there were 519 arrests in 2010 and 318 last year, according to the article, that would probably be 2011 if the article was printed in 2012. So that kind of goes to show what was just going on under Obama.
And bear in mind that that 2009 to 2014, that 1,240 something, that was the 2% of the documents that the DHS OIG had available and released to the organization that did the study, Intercept. That is 2% of the reported cases during that span of years.
I read this and I'm not surprised.
It's just the people who are largely unaffected or under-affected by this, but are aware of it, people like you and me, all we're left with is impotent rage and this ugly feeling that the next turn in the road will not surprise us. Not being surprised by this is, I think, indicative of a massive societal problem. Not to invoke the ancient tomes, but how much will the spectacle of this take away from us as human beings, as individuals, as communities?
And it's especially egregious because it is happening to kids. These kids are being detained, separated from their parents, thrown into what is basically a concentration camp, given Mylar blankets, which look like aluminum foil, and making them sleep on the floor. And there are pictures of this. Like hundreds of pictures if you go online of what these facilities look like, and they look like prisons, they look like camps. If it were any other country doing it, then the international response
would be bombing them.
Exactly. The response from the international community would be a lot different if it was any other country doing this to anybody.
Could you imagine if the fucking UN Security Council was disbanded? What would happen to the United States? The Security Council exists because it allows the United States and Russia and China to control the rest of the countries. Like, if that didn't exist, all the rest of the countries in the UN, their votes would actually matter, and the US would be embargoed into oblivion.
Well, Faolan had a very interesting and entertaining take the other night about the parallels to these semi-concentration camps we're running right now for our undocumented migrants and the FEMA death camps that were being bellowed about.
Yes.
Was that 9 years ago? Would you care to extrapolate on that?
Okay, so way back in the day, if you were into conspiracy and you listen to Alex Jones and everything, Alex Jones and others would always run these huge stories about how under the Bush administration, they were preparing for martial law. They were building all the death camps next to like railways. They were always these big stories. They had pictures and it looked like some really disturbing stuff on the surface anyway. But if you take this and you extrapolate to what's happening now, we have concentration camps already. Border Patrol is running them. Immigration's running them. And who even knows if the people, everybody that immigration's rounding up, who even knows if they actually even are undocumented immigrants? What if I was pulled over, even though I'm white, and just said, F you, I'm not going to produce an ID? And, would they just shove me in one of these camps and just say that I'm here illegally?
They shoved, by their definition, true Aryans into concentration camps all the time just for saying no.
Well,
not
political
necessarily.
prisoners got lighter sentences, but here's a really bad take for you. It's a partisan issue. FEMA death camps that target conservatives? Bad. DHS death camps that target undocumented immigrants? Good.
Yeah, because here's the thing. The right wing, that for nearly a decade screamed about this issue, are suddenly silent. They're like, oh, concentration camps? I totally forgot about the story. Sexual abuse? Oh, they're screaming about Q and the accusations of all that big conspiracy going on with the Clintons and all that has very little evidence behind it. But something that has a lot of evidence behind it, that we have thousands of testimonies of people being sexually abused in these camps that we just described. Those people, it happens all the time. It's just part of the system. It's how it works. It's okay.
And, being a just and fair country, we'll investigate 4% of them. Again, 30,000 pages of reports since 2015. A different organization, between 2009 and 2014, 2% of what they released is 1,245. I mean, these are real numbers.
And it really does lead to question, though, how do you lose so many people? How do you lose 1,475 or however much it was? It's ridiculous. It's like...
Because you don't have the money or the funding or the place to house them. Like, Hitler actually funded his concentration camps. What?
That's a bad take.
That is a very bad take.
I mean, just insinuate yourself into the system and be like, well, what you fellas are doing wrong here. But on the subject of the 1,500-ish lost children, I did read an interesting counterpoint that I would like to discuss. Now, I can't put any verisimilitude behind this. I did not read very much, and I'm sorry. There was a post that said that the lion's share of these incidents, of these kids being lost, were the child services that were supposed to house them after they were released from DHS custody. They made only cursory attempts to do routine checks.
They would do a single phone call, and then if they didn't pick up or if they didn't give them any information, they would just put a checkbox that the kid was basically missing in the system. That was their idea of keeping manifests, and according to the said person that released this information, he's saying that it's actually a good thing the way that he's spinning it, because that means that ICE can't try to relocate these children. However, my problem with that is even if that's true, that's still gross negligence on part of the government, that they can't have some manifest created that is held by a third party that has just enough information to determine that the children are in safe hands, but not enough information to determine the location of where the children are. And even if they had manifested, had full information on it, we have a classification system within the United States. All they need to do is expand or implement that particular system within Border Patrol so that Border Patrol does not have the security clearance to access that information without a warrant or some other information, or even just not at all.
Well, I mean, it would be an open spigot on government resources, but yeah, handle it not unlike witness protection systems. I think there are good points on either side of this argument here, but any way you slice it, this is a categorically ugly situation, and I'm not a terribly smart person, so this is sort of apropos, but I am just not finding an actionable solution to this that could be implemented without the kids being in more danger because of a categorically corrupt government, or the kids being in more danger because they got actually lost. And that really concerns me.
And we already know that some of these children were sold off to human traffickers. It was like 40-something, 50-something kids. We know for a fact ended up in the hands of human traffickers. Now, we don't know how much that number actually is. It could be in the triple digits. It probably is, because we just don't have the information. And then there's also the disturbing part. What if we don't have the information because the kids no longer exist? Maybe they liquidated them because they were too expensive to intern, basically.
I already had to like cover the Maoist bumper sticker on my car because
Oh,
he can
okay.
read Chinese.
How?
So like,
All right, so on the subject of the theory that the children were liquidated, to put it politely, as a cost-saving measure, I could very easily dismiss that as hyperbole. Put it in the conspiracy theory camp. If not for one thing, this is a bit personal. I don't know how many of you have felt this as much as I have, but there's this thing where you find out about some new scandal or some new part of history that the establishment has tried to bury, and you're just blown back by how obscene it is. When people first began to find out the uglier details of the Holocaust, after thinking, oh, it's probably just a few camps, I'm sure they were absolutely blown away by it, and I'm sure that very few of them, if any, examined the very real possibility of the scale of it. So while I will say I'm pretty sketchy about the idea that 1,500 or some number like that of children were killed by the United States government, I don't think that's our most plausible or probable answer to this.
I don't think that they're like dead in a ditch somewhere. But I think it's very possible that they just say, "These are too many. We don't have the money. We don't have the funding. Just send them away. Whoever says they come and they're their parents, they're their parents. Get rid of them." I'm sure that's how they ended up in the hands of people traffickers. Oh yeah, we're this kid's parents. So well, we don't have the money or the place to put him. So yeah, you're his parents, or you're a relative, or you're a family friend. I don't care who you are. Take him. That is very, very believable to me, because God forbid the Republican Party actually fund their concentration camps.
Well, examining it from that angle, first come, first serve kind of thing, free kids, that does seem plausible in a way that is perhaps as revolting as the idea that they mass grave them.
Solution.
To be upsettingly cavalier about it.
It would be absolutely in character for this administration as well. This is not an administration marked by abject, purposeful cruelty and evil. It's an administration marked by self-serving buffoonery and absolute gorging at the trough at the expense of everyone.
Yeah, like a mixture of callousness and incompetence.
Yeah, that would be much more in character for something that this administration would do.
The only reason, though, that I did bring that up, though, as a possibility is because it wouldn't be out of character entirely for the U.S. government. There's always been these rumblings of things like this happening, not necessarily within...
Maybe we could talk a bit about DynCorp. There's some interesting material in here. My take on this so far is they are the archetypal evil PMC company we see in video games and movies.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going with that. Within the notes is that...
private military contractor, private security contractor, private security consultant. It's just a bunch of euphemisms for literal modern-day mercenaries.
Yeah, there's Blackwater in my head.
Yeah, that's actually where I was going with that, actually, was DynCorp. That DynCorp actually has a huge history of human trafficking basically done under the eyes of the U.S. government, and perhaps with the assistance of the U.S. government, dating back to at least an incident in Bosnia where they actually hired an ex-cop from Nebraska and sent her over to Bosnia. And she basically got entrapped in a human trafficking scheme, and they kidnapped her. Like DynCorp, her employer, kidnapped her and tried to sell her as a sex slave.
If I'm understanding this report correctly, she was actually there in Bosnia researching this for the specific purpose of writing a report for the United Nations. And the interesting thing is, when she got out of this, and thank heavens she did, she actually presented to the United Nations in her report that a number of the people she saw involved in this weren't just DynCorp personnel, but actual United Nations personnel.
Yeah, it was one of those conspiracies, if you will, that kind of went all the way to the top almost. And there's a great movie about that. If our listeners want to check it out, it's called The Whistleblower. It came out 2010, 2011. A great movie on the topic, and I highly recommend that you go watch it. But it's not a thing that is a historical aberration per se. Right after this happened during the Iraq War, there were all sorts of allegations that involved human trafficking. And in Afghanistan, DynCorp actually kidnapped children and used them as the bachi-bazi, which were like the boy toys for the warlords in Afghanistan, where they would dress them up like females, put them in dresses, and they would do sexual favors for these guys. Really, really sick stuff. This is all well known and documented.
For any of you who are not explicitly familiar with the Bacha-Bazi tradition, it is a subject that gets a little bit darker than I think a lot of us reasonable people would be comfortable with consuming a lot of. But to abbreviate it, they're dancing boys. They're forcibly feminized, put in women's clothing, and they're used in brothels as a substitute for girls. I'm sure anyone can imagine.
Why is it impossible to talk about the right wing without talking about this fucking issue? Why is this suddenly married hand in hand?
You know what the ironic part is all of this like comes into play after the whole like Q conspiracy theory, where Q is basically throwing this allegation out towards all sorts of Democratic politicians and people within the establishment. So it's no surprise to me. It's just more projection from the right.
That is where it always seemed to originate. Like, all of their conspiracy theories are just predictions about what next month's news story is going to reveal the right wing has been doing all the time. You want to know, if you're a journalist and you want to know what story you're going to be writing next month, just go on 4chan.
That's, a broken clock is right twice a day, but it seems like a broken political ideology is right several months in advance, just about the wrong side of the coin.
So, like, I guess... Like,
well,
how
it shouldn't
do this before you just get desensitized to it?
It shouldn't be surprising, though, that the right wing excuses this behavior when it does show up on there. Because, like, the whole sexual allegations, like with the immigrants and where DynCorp kind of ties into this, is people during the Iraq War did actually apologize for DynCorp. Not everybody on the right did. Some even did denounce it. That's actually where I found a lot of this, was conspiracy sites from right-wingers who were denouncing Bush, surprisingly enough. That's where I found a lot of that information. The more I looked into it, the deeper the allegations got, but it looked like that there were facts that just could not be dismissed. The Bacha-Bazi stuff, like, that's all real stuff. Now, the stuff that I did find that was speculation was that DynCorp also operated as the rent-a-cops or child protective services. Take that what you will, but that spawned some ugly rumors. None of it can be proven, pretty much. If even 1% of it's true, it's still shocking. And that's all I'm going to go into on that.
Of course, we can't take allegations as literal fact. That violates any code of ethics in any level of journalism, even our little leftist radio podcast here. But to add a little bit of strength to these allegations, look at how high up it goes within the organization. DynCorp, they were formerly headed by a retired general, James Grazioplin. This individual, of course, well after his career with them, was arrested for pedophilia charges, accusations of pedophilia charges dating between, 1983 and 89. That's heavy stuff. When the guy who runs your company is pulled in for something like that, even after his tenure there, that does not say good things about the higher echelons of your organization.
Should it really be surprising, though? This is an ideology that enforces this idea that as long as it makes you feel good or as long as it benefits you, then it's okay. Like, in the long run, that's basically what a lot of these people believe when you start talking about, like, the Randian side of the coin.
And you look at, because, we have to tie this into, the fact that we're all furries somehow. I mean, if you look at all furry, it's really just like abject nihilism.
Oh, God, that's gross. Oh, man, yeah, no, those guys, there's some serious grossness.
I'm not even talking about that part. you look at Alt Furry and their entire chat that is filled from like abject neo-Nazis to like libertarians to ANCAPs to a bunch of people who don't really have any ideology, and they just want to be like offensive and gross. It's literally just nihilism and hedonism with a bunch of fancy words over it to try to turn it into an actual ideology, to turn whatever
they use philosophy to add a veneer of morality on it, but it's a false veneer.
Yeah, and that is almost all of what I see in right-wing media and intellectuals. Like, even Jordan Peterson is the point where he's just making up big words to throw in there for philosophy that is basically, I hate SGWs and girls. And like we were talking about before with Evola and etc., I've never read Evola because why? Of all the intellectual starboys that the right wing is fielding right now, none of it is even that kind of race realism stuff. That's all beneath the surface in the 4chan shit tier app, in the IRC channel. It's all at this point just, oh, well, what about the children? Oh, screw them. I want to jack off. That's it. That's what it amounts to.
Help me with this. Am I understanding this correctly? What you're saying is that you think that a lot of right-wing ideology fundamentally is trying to justify a need to gratify their base desires by putting a veneer of intellectualism over it, by trying to legitimize it with big words and dramatically overarching concepts that lead to conclusions like, racism isn't real. They say, I like spewing racial epithets, and that makes me feel good, and they sound like children. But on the other hand, they say, racism isn't real, and your feelings concerning racism are dumb and fake and made up, and therefore it's okay, objectively, morally, for me to say that. Is that the point you're driving here?
Yeah, exactly. They're hearing people calling them on their bullshit. They've been hearing it for the past few years. They realize the vulnerability of their situation. They know more than 50% of this country lives in poverty, and they are desperate to legitimize their living in poverty as normal and natural so they can go on indulging in all of their wants. Okay, now I have a dog and a helicopter. You want me to keep going?
You're saying such good things. If there's any way we could clean this up and use it.
As the police are circling around me, these are the last words I'll be able to get out to you. All the right wing wants to do is jack off. Don't buy it.
I would hesitate to assume that that is the only factor, but considering everything I've seen and everything I've read up to this point, I think that might be one of the most considerable contributing factors in right-wing philosophy, and I'm actually a little bit astounded at how much of a revelation this is to me.
What makes it worse on top of this is that the excusing isn't just about their own behavior and own opinions. So this isn't just about my right to spew racial epithets and stuff like that. That's not what this is necessarily about. This is about defending the power structure. This is about defending the hierarchy, ultimately. They have almost a divine right, if you will, in their own minds, an entitlement to be the boss. They feel like they've worked for their money and they have a right, since they worked their way all the way up to the top, to exploit other people. And that's really what this is all about.
Yeah, like there's more to it.
It's hierarchies upon
even
hierarchies, getting classes and types of people to war between each other.
But even like thinking through the idea of the ethno-state, what is that? That's just a privileged state. That's literally just power organized to continue to satiate my fetishes.
What it essentially is you're taking and creating a second class of people who are ethnic minorities and building your glorious state, if you will, on top of their work through either exploiting them through work or colonizing them.
Which even in itself is a fundamentally intellectually lazy concept. Let's talk about classism as it pertains to racism from the right-wing point of view. And there's a bit of hyperbole here, bear with me. So we need to be the upper class, and we need a lower class to support us, like the filthy parasites we are. Who gets to be the lower class? What test are we going to use? What's going to be the litmus for mud people? Well, hey, nature already does that. Just take the ones with darker skin than us. That works. It's easy.
It creates a visual indicator, which also means that white people who are born with dark skin also get mistreated and placed into this system as well. And the second thing that they do that's even more egregious on top of that is they get people of color fighting between themselves by incentivizing a type of whiteness within black communities and communities of people of color. Like, there's a big thing I've seen growing up in the black community where people that are really black are treated like crap within the black community. And it's called colorism.
Well, that just makes it more fair and egalitarian, because racism isn't just for the white people anymore. See, we're making progress here, guys.
Race to the bottom. So what do you mean by people who are, quote, really black are treated like
dark people with darker skin within?
Oh,
yeah.
Okay, I thought you
not
meant
the attitude, like not the cultural.
Okay, yeah. I thought you meant
like, so there is that too. So there is
clean cut.
Yeah, so there is that too. Like, African Americans, of course, we all know, are told, like, if you dress like a white person and all this and act white, like you won't get treated, such and such. And of course, it's all bullshit anyway. Like, racists are gonna do their racist thing regardless how African Americans act or portray themselves, simply because these people are racist and that's how they operate. It's just an excuse for them at the time to mistreat somebody based off of their own preconceptions.
And so I'm sure there's a part of the black world that buys that and tries to distinguish themselves from the undesirable part of black society by kicking them in the shins, essentially.
Yeah, unfortunately, that is the case.
Which, as the old axiom goes, racism never really dies. It just changes.
Right, and it's hard for us, especially like as white people. There is that theory out there that we actually cannot totally separate ourselves from racism because we have been... We've basically just been trained in it all our lives. So we have these preconceived notions, and it's hard for us to, if you will, decolonize, as they like to say, our minds. One of the leaders of the biggest gangs, if you will, the Proud Boys, sent out some of his cronies to harass a pretty popular comedian on Twitter, Vic Berger, of Super Deluxe fame. And he's had his work featured on Fox, on Cartoon Network. He apparently made a video that McKinns did not like. He basically had the Proud Boys show up on his doorstep and threaten him.
Which is terribly amusing. I don't know very much about the Proud Boys. I've recently had to research them a little bit. And in all of the online news articles that I've been availed to, they're billed as Antifa's opposite number.
It's kind of funny because like the liberals are always they'll try to paint Antifa as some violent group, which is kind of funny because even if you look at like the most violent things that Antifa's done, I think like one guy like slammed a bike lock into somebody's face at a rally during a fight in which the person that actually threw the bike lock was actually the one being harassed, if you actually look into it.
Well, that's just good old-fashioned Seattle U-Lock justice. But to be fair, Antifa has rather considerably more violent in countries that aren't the United States. But while we're talking just about the Antifa's presence in the United States, I find it particularly interesting that they're characterized predominantly as a violent gang of anti-government, anti-establishment, anti-society hooligans, and the Proud Boys, who I understand rose independently of this. The Proud Boys are characterized as the alt-right's answer to that, a white nationalist fight club, a super traditionalist fight club.
These guys are pretty much nothing more than 2010 version of Hell's Angels, but without the cool motorcycles.
They all fucking drive Kias. In before McGinnis turns out to be a pedo. Like, I'm just calling it.
Did you see the video, by the way? Because McGinnis melts down. It's like a super clip of all the times that he like melted down on his show. And it ended with the time that, and this happened recently on his podcast, he exposed himself to his audience. And that was the palest, whitest, shiniest butt and balls that I had ever seen on a human being. It was radiant. The white volume on the pixels on my monitor actually like bled in around it, so it had like a glow around it.
The great white snore.
Done with the deeply uncomfortable part of our talk tonight, friends.
His ass,
oh boy,
his ass shines like the glaciers of the Great White North.
Hey, no, look, if I want to ogle a gutless chicken hawk the washrooms at the local police fraternity, we don't need to talk.
That is truly an Aryan ass. I can't even say.
All this assery aside, I found it very interesting the way that their little operation was instigated. He sent a message, I believe, a couple of tweets in text form that effectively greenlighted the fella gangland style.
The Proud Boys operates just like a gang. Like the FBI, if they want to investigate somebody, they should be investigating these guys. Because I can tell you, they've committed a few crimes. One of their like levels of initiation, like to get to their fourth level, is you got to do time in the can for part of the calls.
Speaking of gangs and a fourth level of initiation involving having to do time behind bars for the cause, who spent some time in prison with a fairly high-ranking individual in the the Crips gang, and he said that the reason for that was that there were a lot of Crips doing life sentences or long sentences in there. So when somebody got sent to prison doing a small-time crime to get into the Crips, they were just getting sent to basic training, and that level of canniness in a criminal organization is very interesting to observe, and I shouldn't wonder if the Proud Boys have appropriated that particular tactic in this case.
Okay, so to give you some introduction on the Proud Boys, Gavin McInnes went on his podcast, and he actually declared the Proud Boys on the podcast. He was like, I'm going to start up a new group. I'm going to call it the Proud Boys. And like his co-host kind of gave him this weird look or something like that. Like because the name was like a sissy name, and he's like, no, I'm gonna call it the Proud Boys because all like the big 19th century gangs, they all had sissy names because if you messed with those people, they would kill you, so you didn't laugh when you heard their name. Understanding that, it does make a lot of sense that that's the pattern he's following, because it very much fits in with that whole idea of how gangs operate.
So you're saying here that the standing implication is that this man went and intentionally built himself a gang, a criminal enterprise.
Yes.
He took a mind to do that, and he went and did it.
Yes, and he declared the entity of the Proud Boys on his podcast. He made parallels to 19th century gangs and basically told people to go out and do shit to leftists.
That doesn't strike me as what's the word for it in this country? Legal.
It is not legal at all, and the law's just turning a blind eye to it, which shows you whose side of the law the police are on. Because had this been a leftist that went out and did this, if it would have been me on my podcast saying, I'm gonna go out there and I want you guys to form the Fancy Nancy's, and I want you to go beat up any right-wing person you see. Especially give like any skinheads like a double punch. If they're on a bridge, make sure they fall off the bridge. You know, if I were to do that, I would be thrown in the can immediately.
I mean, can we do that?
No, we can't. There is now a precedent, but it's also non-productive from our standpoint. A brawling club of leftists just is not productive. It's not really gonna resonate anyway, and it's a bad idea, and no.
Wait, so you're saying that the right uses bad praxis in their doings politically on the ground level?
Absolutely. See, the right uses really bad praxis. what they're doing is eventually going to turn people against them because they're going to beat up the wrong person one day and it's going to get news coverage and they're just going to be painted as what they are, which is not a gang. It's a terrorist organization. That's right. I said it. Gavin McGinger leading a terrorist organization.
McGinger?
Get McGinger, whatever. Yeah, come at me, bro. I fucking dare you.
They've got him, and he's starting his gang, and then you've got Jordan Peterson, who's giving it the said intellectual backing. Like, this is the beginning of an actual party. You look at...
This is basically what the Nazi Party was before they were actually the Nazi Party officially, when they were like the National Socialist Workers something or other. I mean, they even have they have a so-called left wing.
If you look at like who Eichmann was before he was in the Nazi government, he was Jordan Peterson. He was a guy at a university that no one liked.
Even if you look at the Nazi Party like in the early 1920s, even up until like they got in power, the Nazi Party had a so-called left wing, and they eventually purged it. They killed everybody in it.
So what you're saying is that this is a modern day brown shirts.
Yeah, no, exactly.
We can't call them brown shirts. That's not accurate. We'd have to call them white wife beaters.
Oh, God.
I'm just saying, when you say Gavin exposed himself on the air, we're not just talking about his genitals here. We're talking about a very dangerous level of political goofing about.
Well, he can do that because he feels that anybody that makes fun of, he can just go after. What I was getting at, actually, yeah. So Gavin is basically leading the brown shirts at this point. Really, I actually see him less as like an Adolf Hitler and more like an Oswald Mosley kind of character in terms of actual caricature.
But the fact is, like, that style of street engagement just got his ass kicked. Like, if that's the way they're going about it. They rely so much on police protection. You know, if you look at Charlottesville, and then immediately the day after that, like, gathering of, like, actually, I think it might have actually been the Proud Boys, but I forget. These guys, they change their names every, like, 5 weeks. So there was, 6 of them at a park? And, like, 60,000 people in, what was it, Boston, I think? Like, just poured into the streets because there was no warning. Like, there was no police protection. This was literally just like a post on a meetup group, a park defending free speech or whatever, like 6 guys. 60,000 people poured out of their houses. And there was no advance time. There was no setup for police controls, no barricades. And that's what happens when you catch the police off guard. And eventually they're going to get cocky and they're going to decide, you know what, we don't need the police protection anymore. We don't need to give advance notice for our rally. We don't need them to block off streets and control the protesters so that, you know, nothing actually happens. Just going to go down the street one day and they're just going to get wiped out.
One of the things that I also wanted to bring in attention to Antifa is that a right-wing politician in Virginia actually went after some environmentalists, and he used the term green Antifa to describe these guys. The reason that this is particularly disturbing is this is because, one, he's trying to malign environmentalists with Antifa, which isn't always the case. In fact, many of these environmentalists were local people that probably voted Republican. They just don't want the pipeline in their backyard. So a lot of it's NIMBYism. But the disturbing part about this particular story is that on top of that, he went on to say that these environmentalists were influenced by Russian propaganda, which is a talking point that we saw right after the DAPL protests, where CNN and MSNBC ran a few months later after DAPL was pretty much wrapping up, that they found some Russian propaganda and just assumed that the entire thing was organized by Russians and that all these environmentalists were basically dupes. The idea that native peoples or locals can't get together because they don't have brains big enough to see that an oil pipeline is a threat to their neighborhood.
What, you want clean water? Oh, you must just be Russian spies. No American wants to drink clean water.
This is a little bit late in the conversation, but I wanted to point out, if I'm not incorrect here, Heather Heyer's birthday was yesterday. And
Happy birthday and rest in power.
I think that it's important for all of us to remember the real human cost of this and the real risk and what is actually at stake against homegrown terrorist organizations.
And I think the best way we can do that is by actually pushing people to recognize them as such. I interact with like regular normal ass furries in chat rooms, and they're just the most oblivious people on earth. They can't see that there's terrorists growing in this country and that it's their friends. It's people that they've seen at cons. It's dojo.
Well, as you often say, it's dismissed within the fandom as just more furry drama. Like, outside of the fandom, it's all dismissed as that's just politics. Albeit we're talking about the most recent person of color to be riddled with bullets by a force of arms whose job it is explicitly to protect and serve, apparently. And they're like, well, why are you getting all political? My friend, this is not politics. This is life and death for people who aren't you.
And then when politics is invoked, it's for propagandizing. It's the crap like I just pointed out here, where if people go out to a protest, it's not because they care about their community. It's because they saw some post on Facebook that could or could not have been put up there by the Russians.
The biggest signal that is being sent is that people in this supposed democracy don't want to and discourage and are afraid of being seen talking about politics.
Well, yeah, that's
to the point
true.
Where they don't understand even what it is. And I don't blame them, because politics is represented as this thing of talking people on the news, and you don't really understand it, and they're just angry all the time, and it's like, I'm supposed to hate these people, and these people want me to hate these people. I don't understand why I should hate either, and it's all too complicated, and I just want to go home and play my video games, leave me alone. And it's made that way to be on purpose, so that politics is just this thing that only some people go and do every 2 years in a booth at a church or at a park. And that's politics to most people. The idea that it's more than that it's something every day that you engage with just by waking up, is like the most mind-blowing alien thing to people. When people are discouraged from talking about that daily life, like, something is really wrong, and it's not a democracy anymore. And I've been banned from many, many chat rooms for, quote, causing drama and being a problem, and it's because I've decided there's never going to be a right place, there's never going to be a right time, you're never supposed to actually talk about issues. So I've just decided I'm just going to talk about them, and I'm going to be banned. And I want more people to do that and not give a shit if they're banned, because that's literally the only way that we are not going to get caught with our pants down when some furry gets blown away. It's literally the only way that we are going to be able to have a community, is if people just stop giving a shit about this idea that we're not supposed to cause any kind of problems and pretend that we're just all isolated and safe from politics. It's the only choice. Otherwise, you're just not going to be able to talk about anything. And you're just going to slowly just see everything you care about die, and see no one really care that it is dying.
That is, I think, one of the heavier dangers of liberalism, and this is a very heavy subject that I think we need to discuss in greater depth at some point. The only headway I've ever been able to make with regular, just non-furry people, my coworkers, my friends, etc., is to slowly and politely explain to them, it may seem like politics are boring and complicated and kind of scary and nothing ever gets done, but that's just because you can't see the large changes that take place over a great deal of time, and that's by design. Think about it like this. Politics affects literally every single aspect of your life. If the politics were more green-friendly, the air would be less polluted and you wouldn't have such bad asthma. Or if the politics were more libertarian, then your boss would be able to screw you over in that way you hate even more. If politics were more left-wing and more conducive to social welfare programs, remember the other day you couldn't afford lunch and I had to spot you for it? The government would be able to help with that and subsidize with that. Politics affect literally every aspect of your day-to-day life. You realize that if one politician gets too angry, they'll make video game violence illegal, or censor it heavily like they did in Germany, and you can't play your Call of Duty Battle Honor or whatever it is anymore. This affects everything. And you don't need to jump into it head first, full force, and start reading all the ancient texts and learning all the cool buzzwords and lingo. You just need to be aware of the fact that this affects you. And if something ever, that you hear it on the radio or on TV, if something ever piques your interest and gets your ears pricked up, maybe you should start paying a little bit more attention.
All of this, it seems like every time, though, that something, like there's a big sea changer or whatever, whether it be on the left or on the right, the establishment media has been using the Russian boogeyman to not only demean, of course, Trump, and we got the investigation, but I'm starting to see the same meme crop up along leftist groups as well, that they're saying that we're also being had by the Russian government, and anybody that's not a centrist or neoliberal, then they're the enemy because they've been propagated against. The Russians have got to them.
And they themselves are completely devoid of any political understanding. Sure, liberals understand, the machinations. At this point, they've been to enough marches at the Capitol to know the timetable of when their representatives is sitting. And that's good. But beyond the understanding of the mechanics of the political structure, they seem completely devoid. Why would the left wing give a shit about what Putin wants or says or does? How would Putin's propaganda produce a left-wing period?
It's ridiculous because they always scream and shout about it, and they always point to things like, oh, you got that off of Russia Today. Well, Russia Today is funded by Russia because it has Russia in the name, and it's just they scream and yell about it, but they don't look at the substance. They don't look at whether something or not's being true. All they look at is that Russian context, and it's polluting the dialogue right now.
Well, that's because it's hard to go and research everything. I'll say the same thing about liberalism and centrism that I'll say about fascism, and that is that it's easy. It's very simple. In fascism or authoritarian systems, you come up with a problem, and you're like, well, what's the root of this problem? Oh, it's people doing this thing. Well, make them not do it. If they don't agree, just round them up and shoot them. Anyone who does the thing, shoot them. It's a very simple solution, and that's appealing because the world is complex, and the way we're educated in the school system and in our social circles, the way that we're educated is not conducive to an understanding of the complexities of modern politics and modern social trends. So in centrism, it's the exact same thing as fascism. It's the easiest solution. You just say, there's bad people on both sides. I think both sides are wrong.
So in other words, what you're saying is both centrism and fascism, to some extent, offer a more instant gratification to the conceived problem.
Yeah, exactly. It's you read the news article once, or you read the headline once, and you go, these are respected journalists. They know what they're talking about. They've done their research, and I guess that's just how it is. And depending upon the media consumption of any given individual, they can get a slew of problematic and flagrantly false ideas just by reading misleading headlines.
Well, nowadays you can't really read headlines to get the news anyway because all the headlines are clickbait and don't even tell you what the story's about these days.
That's largely a problem with capitalism. Clickbait is just that. It's clickbait. It's trying to draw people in and get views to sell ad revenue, which means that sensationalism is explicitly pressed upon these organizations by the very economy they work in, which, I mean...
I'm just waiting for every article on the New York Times to begin with, you'll never believe, and then whatever the thing that they're trying to hint at is.
Yeah, old world respected, old media, print media. The boy runs past in his little driver cap on his little bicycle, and he's like, The news today! And you hand him a nickel and you unroll the newspaper, and it's like, Putin decides to do something unbelievable, and you won't believe what happens next.
The funny thing is I could see that happening. Yeah, news in America is just, it's crap. The literary quality of news in America is crap. It used to be as a journalistic rule. I took high school journalism, okay? I'm not an expert. But one of the things that we were taught in high school was that when you wrote a headline, it had to be a very brief summary of the story. If you read that headline, that's what the story should be, and it needs to summarize it cleanly so that you can get an idea. The first paragraph is supposed to answer the 5 W's. You could read the headline and read the first paragraph, and you'll know everything that you really need to know about that. And then all the rest of the article is expanding on details of those 5 W's.
That was how newspapers were when I was growing up, and I'm neither that young or that old to be able to say that with any degree of weight, but you would look at a newspaper from the mid-90s, and it would say, local furry decides to start a podcast, is surprised at constant interruptions and derailings. And you would just have that extrapolated upon, but you would get the general idea. And if news still functioned that way, especially online news, then I would have a little bit more hope for centrism, and I can't believe I'm saying this, for authoritarian political belief structures, because then they would be getting a more clean and verifiable influx of information about the world around them. But right now, we're just getting literally weaponized stupidity.
So Trotsky's gonna rise from the dead when I say this, but you shouldn't be able to privately own a newspaper or a news station. This just flies in the face of the very idea of journalism. And that's why it all sucks. It's owned by all 5 people.
You know who owns the Washington Post, right?
I'm gonna guess Jeff Bezos.
Yes.
Wait, what are you fucking... I was right? What? God.
They buy up the newspapers, and now the newspapers aren't going to write crap about them, because if they do, they'll just fire the problematic journalists.
That's an issue for me, because there's this narrative in the United States that we're all millionaires going through a temporary, regrettable phase of not being a millionaire. We're all just waiting to break it big because we're all Americans, and any American is potentially a small business owner. Now, my only reasonable skill is speaking and giving people ideas and saying things. I'm good with metaphors. I crack funny jokes sometimes. Are you saying that newspapers shouldn't be privatized, and therefore I have no real way to get super rich the American way off of my only marketable skill? Attica, you sound like a communist.
I think that's because he is.
Spooky. Spooky, spook.
But the last item on the list here that I did want to get today was Supreme Court upholds workplace arbitration contracts barring class actions. So basically what happened was the Supreme Court ruled that if you sign a contract with your job that says that you will not sue in a class action against anything, including breaking the law. So in other words, even if it's just to enforce federal law, you can't create a class action suit. You have to go at it individually, which discourages lawsuits against employers, because it means that these people, one, can't afford to go up against their employer, but two, the costs of doing so career-wise are too devastating to do it individually.
Yeah, and I've read a lot of invective from the left about this. It's understandable, the level of vitriol I'm seeing about this, and I'd be lying if I haven't written some of my own. This is a significant blow against workers' rights the country over, and since a lot of these companies operate offshore as well, this might have effects that reach well outside of the United States. And call me a conspiracy theorist again here, but I think this is a direct result of the weakening of labor unions in the United States.
Well, this is a blow to labor unions as well, because basically what they're saying here is if you sign a contract with us, we could enforce it to do whatever. We could just make you sign a contract saying you can't join a union, and it doesn't matter if that contract is illegal to make. You signed it, buddy.
All this does is it pushes unions out of the realm of bullshitting around with courts that are rigged against them anyway. The labor movement is going to go on regardless of legality. I'm sorry, but if you were counting on unions being legal, you're going to be a poor little peasant forever, buddy. Right now, is Brazil? Are the truckers are still on strike in Brazil, aren't they?
Yeah, I believe so. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so like Brazil's still at a damn standstill. The government's having to call in the army, and the truckers still aren't. I'm hoping that devolves into a full-on general strike. I've always considered Brazil like the one blind spot, right, in the world where like the socialist revolution could take off and would be pretty invulnerable. It can only happen in a few countries where it's not just going to be immediately bulldozed. Like, yeah, it could happen in Greece, but Greece is Greece. Like, it's just going to get locked into a battle with Turkey and waste all of its resources. But, it has to happen in the US, in Russia, or, actually happen again in China, and I've always considered Brazil one of those places where it has enough sway and enough resources, enough land mass. And
it could really be its own
neighbors.
Superpower if it wanted to.
So, nothing of what they're doing is legal. Nothing labor does in its defense of its interest is, quote, legal. Because all the law is the bourgeois legalizing their robbery. I mean, yeah, there's laws like, don't murder people. Like, there's different purposes for laws. But when it comes to working laws, when it comes to economic laws, all it is the owners of production legalizing robbery. A lot of people were pulling their hair out over it, and I'm like, A, I'm not surprised. And B, all this is going to do is it's going to push workers to do what they actually need to do, to stop bullshitting around with their courts, with their liberal labor unions, who cut them off at every turn from actually getting anything done.
It's great and all if you do join a union, like the AFL or something like that. It's a corporate union, okay, good, whatever. It's getting involved, I guess. But the big changes, they're not going to happen with the corporate unions because they're in bed with the employers to some extent anyway. If the unions really want to make any changes, if they really want to do something, they're going to have to do it regardless of what the law says. Let's just say under Trump, they managed to pull through federal right to work. Yeah, that's absolutely horrible. That is a worst case scenario for unions. But what this really does mean for unions is it means that we can pull out all the stops. We can recruit how we want. We don't have to work with employers necessarily to get things done. We don't have to do any of that. We can go full hog wild with it, and there's not a darn thing that they can do. What are they going to do? Throw us in jail? Because of course.
Well, a long time ago, my father, he told me how the unions have historically been associated with organized crime. And at the time, I was like, ooh, mobsters, spooky, unions, bad. But now I'm thinking about it, and now having read a little bit of that historical
cool.
Well, yeah, kind of cool. But now that I've read a little bit more of the historical context, there is a real reason for that. And that's because at the time, the mobs were the only people who could stand up against the police and the class that owned the means of production, because everything else was gutless. If you just had a bunch of guys who decided they wouldn't work, they'd be replaced, or they would be killed in secret, or the bosses would turn one of them and make a deal and dismantle it. The unions actually turned to organized crime because a crime lord would walk into the company owner's office
for the militia. Basically, because
yes,
during the 1920s, they basically made private militias illegal because people were making private militias in West Virginia and other states to go up and fight against like the coal companies and the mining companies.
Yes, explicitly. That is the beginning of the historical context in which unions have always been in bed with organized crime. And now that I'm thinking about it and looking at the historical context and what's going down with the state of labor in this country right now, I'm thinking, if these are going to be illegal organizations, and if I'm banking on a New Age Black Panther Party coming up, I don't want to explicitly sound like an illegalist here, but this could swing hard left very fast for a lot of people.
Well, you know how Stalin funded the Russian Communist Party, right? Supposedly.
Wait, like...
He robbed banks in Georgia.
Oh, okay. I thought you meant like when
the country
organized. Yeah, Stalin's just running around Atlanta.
Give me all your money, honky. Hey man, give this guy all the money in there. There's a dang old commie back there, and his dad's gun.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Like, I didn't know the funding came from. Like, isn't there that story that the right wing likes to cite? It's like, oh, look at hypocrite communists. That really just sort of proves that Lenin was a genius in getting the German Empire to give him a bunch of gold
he tricked the German Empire into giving him a ton of gold, so he had the funding to do whatever. And then, of course, the right wing spins it as being like some conspiracy theory, of course, because that's the route that they always have to go with it. But it was really just a ploy for him to give them money.
Yeah, it was smart. There's a story from the American Revolution where, like, loyalists and people back in Britain would hang pictures of Washington in their toilet as an insult. And Americans were like, well, that's not an insult. It's the best place to scare the shit out of them. It's like that. It's that kind of propaganda backfiring.
If this is the route unions are going to be subjected to, and if the government clamps down on them, then yeah, of course, there's going to be no choice, because when it comes down to it, people aren't just going to roll over. At some point, people are going to defend themselves.
As one of your bullet points here points out, a new economic study shows that unions help drive up wages among the working class. They increase social mobility and effectively decrease the burden of social inequality. And that's all within the structure of the system we're working in right now. That's all within the structure of late-stage capitalism.
You know what? Actually,
crony capitalism.
Okay, so
as it is called.
When unions were at their height, we were not experiencing late-stage capitalism. Late-stage capitalism started occurring basically under neoliberalism. I would say that really 2007 was like really the beginnings of late stage capitalism. Maybe there were some rumblings before then, but that's really when the decay started. I would pin it about there. Unions were active though during the height of what you would call the American Empire for the average person. The average person during the 50s, the 60s, the 70s experienced a rapid increase in quality of life and wealth, all because they were part of a union that bargained and negotiated their pay and benefits.
Yeah, some actually really hard numbers on this is detailed in a recent paper, Unions and Inequality Over the 20th Century, New Evidence from Survey Data. It was written by these economists, Henry Farber, Dan Herbst, Ilyana Kuziemko, and Suresh Naidu. And, geez, I'm going to have to dedicate half a day to really looking into this. But, geez, would you like some numbers? Here's some numbers. In 1962, the income boost from union membership was nearly 5 times larger for workers of color than white workers. You want to talk about social mobility, irrespective of race relations in this country, in the early 60s? That is a powerful number when you think about the social detritus around having them colored boys move the cans of beer to the back this time. Very, very interesting stuff.
Right, and then you look at the situation now where we have this shrinking middle class issue where the working class are getting less and less of the pie. We've gone down from a height of around 30% in 1955, and it remaining pretty steady. It declined, but very slowly, and then all of a sudden in the late 70s, union memberships took a dip, and we ended up with union membership being 10.7% of all workers, and most of those workers are government employees. Almost nobody in the private sector is part of a union unless like you're a trucker or something like that, or in a specific industry.
This is going to sound very communist and a little bit tinfoil hatty, but would it be very silly to try and draw a line between the reduction, the decline rather, that's an important distinction, the decline of the power of labor unions in this country and the dramatically increased social tension between people with divisive political beliefs, between people of different races, and most especially between people of different social classes?
Yes, because it plays into the whole like idea of kyriarchy? Are you familiar with what that is?
Give me the Cliff's Notes. Please enlighten me.
Okay, so kyriarchy is, it's like the opposite of intersexualism. So intersexualism is, let's say you're black and you're gay. You're going to have a bad time because you're subject to both prejudices. So kyriarchy is basically how the hierarchy interacts along with various structures. And union membership does kind of play a part in that, because creating unions unifies, for a better word, the working class. It creates a force within the working class that's beyond race, for instance, or at least I somewhat hope anyway.
That's actually exactly what I'm asking, is with the decline, the pretty significant decline in union membership nowadays, it's a lot easier for people in the working class like me and other people in the working class, like your average neo-Nazi, to look at one another and go, there's basically nothing that holds us together. But I'm supposing here, I'm maybe a little bit out of turn and maybe a little bit ignorant, but I'm supposing here that if labor unions more effectively unified that person and me, if we marched under the same banner, economically speaking, we might be more inclined to march under the same banner ideologically or socially speaking.
Yes, actually, because the more you actually expose yourself to people of different ideas or whatever cultures, etc., the more accepting you are of others. That's actually why communities that have a more diverse population, like ethnically, are more tolerant towards each other than, let's say, like a rich white community that maybe only has like 2 or 3 black people that live in it. You know, that's the kind of community where they see a person of color and they pick up the phone and say, "Oh my God, there's somebody that doesn't belong in our neighborhood. I've never seen him before."
Oh my gosh, does that actually happen?
Yeah, it does.
To me, and I'm white. I ended up breaking down on my scooter, and I had to pull off the road into like this really nice white neighborhood. And I was sitting there for an hour waiting for a tow truck, and I just watched as one by one grumpy old white man stepped out of his house onto his porch, sneered at me, stood there for 5 minutes, and then went back inside.
So they knew you didn't belong because 1, you were on a scooter, and 2, you're probably dressed too poor for the neighborhood. So
I'm sorry, naturally, I was being very silly there. But we know study after study after study after paper after study proves pretty conclusively that you get a larger number of hate crimes in communities, in entire counties that are less ethnically or nationally diverse. You get more homophobia in places, institutions, workplaces, schools, where there are not as many people who are out and accepted. We know this empirically. We know this scientifically. It is a hard statistic.
The big takeaway here is that unions are important to our society, and that if you have a job, you should heavily consider joining a union, regardless of the legality, regardless of the propaganda, because being part of a union helps defend you from retributions of your employer, good or bad. It gives you an outlet to discuss problems at your job. It gives you an outlet to discuss what you're being paid, etc. And the disappearance of these unions only makes things more difficult for you as a worker in the long run.
And as you said before, any union is a good union. Any union is better than no union. It doesn't matter what sort. It doesn't matter IWW. It doesn't matter United Food Service and retail workers. It doesn't matter if you meet with your coworkers once a week at the local burger joint. You need to rub elbows with your fellow working class. You need to know everyone else's struggles. You need to talk about your experiences and think of ways to deal with any trouble that your employer might give you. You all suffer the same abuses. You all deal with the same things. You all have the same aspiration, which is to get out of any pit that the boss might try to throw you in. You have a common goal. You have a shared interest, and you have each other. All you have to do is reach out and accept that.
And on that note, I do want to leave you guys for the night. But if you liked our show, like, comment, subscribe, share on Twitter, share everywhere. Give us some love. good night and good luck.